St. Paul VI, providential, that as we meet the great saint that challenged marriage to be what it should be in a time when it's so easy to let marriage be something it's not supposed to be. And his great prophetic vision was not only just about marriage. In fact, if you ask me, he challenges marriage to not become self-centered, but sort of like Monica said today, to face the other. Spouses facing each other, parents facing children, in a way that it doesn't become self-centered. And that is the challenge of marriage. In his one of his other great works, Evangelii Nunciandi, he challenges the church to do the exact same thing. Do not become self-absorbed. Do not become complacent in who we are. He says the very essence of the church, the very identity of the church is missionary. And then he goes on to say something I think is so powerful. He said the greatest testimony, the only way we're going to get the world to believe the gospel message is when it finds witnesses. When it actually finds individuals that are trying to live the very thing they profess to be. Whether it be the individual, whether it be the spouses, whether it be the family, whether it be the priesthood or consecrated life. When we profess something, the world is actually going to test whether or not we live it. And that takes time. That's not an immediate response. So that, I think, brings us to our readings. Above all, let your love for one another be intense, because love covers a multitude of sins. That's an interesting word. Let your love be intense, not just fervent. And the Greek word there, ektanes, is where we actually get the word teneo, is where we get the word intense or tension. Becomes the root for that. So when St. Paul, or in this case, St. Peter is saying, let your love be intense, it's let it be stretched to the point that there's a tension in it. And that tension, none of us necessarily like. But he's challenging us, let your love be intense, let it be stretched, let it reach its potential. So a couple weeks ago, I was in Rome, and I had a lunch appointment. So I grabbed a cab. And my cab driver had the good Italian name of Killian. Good Irish name. So Killian, or as they say in Italy, Killian, he saw quickly that somehow I wasn't Italian. And so he threw his 3 or 4 or 5 English phrases out there, and then that was the end of that conversation. But the conversation continued, and at some point, I was working my way across town, so we had about 25 minutes together in this car. And at some point in this conversation, as it developed, I said, "Are you married?" Well, first of all, he's 34 years old, and he's living at home. Okay. And it's, 34 years old. "Are you married?" And he said, "Father, my generation doesn't get married." And I said, "Well, why?" And he said, "Well, money and children, I still live at home. And just, there are a lot of, giving me the Italian way of, there are a lot of reasons why, right? None of which actually make any sense, but there are a lot of reasons. All right. So, at some point, I said, well, how do you, or one of the challenges he said is, we're distracted. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, look at this. I have 2 phones right now on my dashboard, right? One was Waze and the other one was Google. And then he holds up, he reaches down and goes, look, I got a third phone. And he said, I don't think we know how to take time and to be down. And I said, why do you think that is? And he says, I don't think we like being quiet. And I said, that's one of the great challenges, is just taking space. And in this first thing, it said, the end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be serious and sober-minded so that you'll be able to pray. Put things in perspective. And so I asked him, I said, well, what is it about being silent that you don't like? And he said, well, these feelings and these thoughts. And I said, well, what scares you? And he said, well, that's a good question. He said, I don't actually know how to commit. And I was like, welcome to the human race. We actually don't know how. And this conversation started. I said, one of the beautiful things about actually learning to deeply enter into a relationship is we all learn how to love. And we all learn how to be loved. And he said, that scares me. I said, it scares all of us. I said, it scares me. Every single time the demand of love presents itself, it scares me. And even letting people love us scares us. That sense of being seen as we're, to actually let people see us. I said, that is the challenge. I said, are you dating anybody? And he says, yes. I said, hay una grazia. And he said, yes. And I said, is she somebody you would marry? And he goes, oh, sorry, let me back up. I said, do you want to be married? We were at a stoplight at this point. I said, do you want to be married? And he looked in the mirror and he goes, I do. Even though his generation doesn't. So I said, do you have a girl? And he says, I do. And I said, is she the type of girl you would marry? And he says, she is. And I said, what's keeping you from doing that? He says, I'm afraid. I'm afraid. And I said, well, let me do this. I'm going to start praying that the two of you come to your senses. And when we got to where we were going, I said, you're not going to believe this, but I'm actually going to a lunch with a couple that has been married for 60 years. And he's like, that's amazing. Then he said, that's like my grandparents. I said, slow down, Tex. But he said, that's amazing. And how they do it. So when we got where we were going, I gave him a blessing. And I've been praying for him and his girlfriend. I get to the lunch. I get into the lunch. I sit down with the couple. And I tell them about my cab ride. And they're smiling. And I said, you came up in my cab ride here. And we were talking. And then both of them said, it's not easy. And I said, oh, I wouldn't imagine it is. And we started talking about some of the things that weren't easy. Well, near the end of this lunch, Maria, she said, Father, next time you're in town, can we find time to talk? Just you and I. And I said, sure. She said, after all we've been through and persevered through, I've actually never been able to unpack that, right? I've never actually been able to look at that. I've never had a spiritual director. And I said, next time I'm in town, we will get together. So why am I telling us this? Because here are a couple thoughts that struck me. One is, whether it's at the beginning or whether it's 60 years into it, everybody needs guidance. Everybody needs guidance. Everybody needs to unpack things. Everybody needs to examine things. So let me put something now from the reading in front of us. Beloved, do not be surprised that a trial by fire is occurring among you. Welcome to marriage. Welcome to consecrated life. Very often we think that trial by fire is coming from the outside. It's on the very inside of the vocation. The vocation itself is the trial by fire that does what? It stretches. Ektanoio. It stretches my love. It creates a tension between my selfishness and my self-giving. And that's the tension of whether I'm going to turn inward or outward, whether I'm going to open or close. That trial by fire is the very process of learning to love. That's what creates witnesses. That's where the witnesses come from. They have got to pass through fire. The process of learning to love and the process of learning to be loved is purifying. And the witnesses will only come when we each commit, each one individually, and then as a couple, and then as a family, and then as consecrated and as legionaries. The moment I stop committing is the moment I start dying, but in the wrong way. In the wrong way. Donna Garrett called me, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago maybe, and she sent me a message saying, hey, have you read Theo of Golden? I said, never even heard of it. #1 New York Times bestseller. She said, well, I just finished it, would love to talk about it. And I said, okay, I'll read it. So I read it. And the other night we were speaking about it. There was a chapter in there, and I'd like to finish it. There was a chapter in there, the protagonist, Theo, from Portugal. You don't know anything about him except his first name. And he comes to Georgia. From New York City, he comes to Georgia. Nobody knows why. We don't know why. Little by little, the story unfolds. But there's a moment when there's a flashback. In Theo, we get this flashback. And Theo is this young little 6, 7-year-old boy. He's been out playing all day, and the sun is setting, and he's walking home. And as he's walking home, he looks up near the Douro River, and he sees a fisherman, boat on the shore. Fisherman, but the fisherman is facing the sunset. And it catches his attention. He sees his rubber boots, he sees his sleeves rolled up, and he starts to walk in that direction because he sees him doing something and he doesn't understand what he's doing. And as he starts to approach, he begins to see something in front of the fisherman. So it keeps pulling him, and little by little he's drawn forward. Well, the fisherman has an easel and a palette, and he's painting, and yet he's a fisherman. And as the boy gets closer, he starts to approach little by little. He somehow perceives this is a sacred moment and I shouldn't break the silence. But as he gets closer, he smells fish and he smells paint. And he begins to look at this painting, and he's watching, because what the artist fisherman is doing is he's looking up, and then he's looking down, and then he's capturing, and he's looking up, and he's looking down, and he's capturing. And finally he gets a little closer, and the fisherman says, if you would actually come on this side, you're going to have a better view. And so he works his way around, doesn't say anything. And the fisherman says, see this? And as he looks out, he says, every fisherman will tell you this is the best time to be fishing. But this is the best time for this. And what do I choose? And he said, so I chose this. And he's painting. And the boy is just watching. And then he takes a moment as he's finishing. He leaves right at the bottom just a little empty space. And he bends down and he picks up mud with the end of his paintbrush. And he puts it on his thumb. And he says to the boy, come here. And he puts it on his thumb, and he says, now rub it on the bottom of this painting. And so Theo doesn't do anything. And he goes, here, I'll show you. And so he takes the dirt and he rubs it across the bottom, all the way across. And now, when there's beautiful painting in the dirt on the bottom. And at some point, the painter had said to him, notice how the sky keeps changing, and I can only capture the colors, but by the time I'm done with that stroke, it's already changed colors. And now there's dirt at the bottom. He said, now you're an artist. So you run home, because it's getting late, and you tell your mother that you now have been painting a picture. And you can go tell her that's why you're late at home. And he takes the picture and he puts it in Theo's hand. And he says, be careful, it's wet. So Theo starts to take this painting and he goes home. And this next phrase I found so powerful. It said, Theo walked home with the sunset in his hands. That's our vocation. That is our vocation. Our vocation is to be fishermen and cast the net. And we've got to have the look and the smell of somebody who actually fishes. And at the same time, we've got to be the artist that knows how to face beauty itself on an open horizon and open ourselves to that beauty in prayer and begin as best we can and with our limitedness to capture the beauty that is communicated, knowing that I can't fully capture it. But as I do, something of the truth is being communicated. And then we teach others to do what? Become artists and fishermen. And he invited him into the painting and he taught him. We form formators. We work one-on-one. And we challenge to mission. That's our gift. We're the ones who are blessed to participate in this. We have to work as hard as the fisherman does, but just as hard we have to pray. Just as hard. We're evangelizing, we're contemplative, and we always make sure Christ is at the center, and we send people home with that experience of Christ, knowing that sooner or later they will communicate it to others.